The mediation room smelled like old coffee and carpet cleaner. I remember thinking that was a strange thing to notice. The smell. When my marriage of 19 years was being dissolved across a table that probably cost more than my first car. My husband, Richard, sat across from me with his lawyer beside him, a man named Pearson who wore cufflinks that caught the fluorescent light every time he moved his wrist. Richard had his arms crossed. He looked comfortable. That was the thing that stayed with me, how comfortable he looked. My lawyer, a woman I'd hired 3 weeks earlier, had just finished laying out my professional history. She'd read it carefully, the way you read something you want people to actually hear. Registered nurse, 22 years. 14 of those in the pediatric intensive care unit at the hospital for sick children in Toronto. Richard uncrossed his arms to reach for his water glass. "She's a bedside nurse," he said to Pearson, not even looking at me. "She changes diapers and takes temperatures. That's not a career. That's a job." Pearson smiled the way men smile when they think they've already won. I didn't say anything. I reached into my folder and placed a single document flat on the table in front of them. Pearson looked down at it. Then he looked up at me. Then he looked back down. "Your Honor," he said, "except we weren't in court, we were in a mediation room on King Street," and for a moment I think he forgot where he was. He straightened in his chair and cleared his throat. "We may need to take a short recess." Richard stopped smiling. "That's where this story ends. But it's not where it started. And if I'm going to tell it right, I have to go back. All the way back to a September in 1999 when I was 26 years old and terrified, starting my first shift in a unit where the smallest patients in the hospital fought for things the rest of us take for granted. Another breath, another morning, another ordinary Tuesday. I grew up in Sudbury, Ontario. My father worked at the nickel smelter and my mother was a school secretary who baked butter tarts every Friday and never once complained about anything that I can remember. Though I know now that she had every reason to. We weren't poor, but we weren't comfortable either. There was a difference between those two things that I understood by the time I was 8. I chose nursing for reasons that had nothing to do with calling or vocation. I chose it because it was a degree I could afford, a career where I would always find work, and because I had spent 2 weeks in a children's hospital when I was 11 after a bike accident, left me with a fractured femur and a fear of hills that lasted until I was in my 30s. I remembered the nurse who'd sat with me at 2 in the morning when I was scared and couldn't sleep. I don't remember her name. I remember she smelled like peppermint, and she told me that the night always feels longer than it is. I did my training at Laurentian and moved to Toronto in 1998. I got my first apartment in Parkdale with 2 roommates, a futon I found on the curb on Lansdowne, and exactly $412 left in my account after first and last month's rent. I was happy in the particular way you can only be happy when you're young and broke, and entirely certain that the future is still negotiable. I met Richard at a New Year's Eve party in 1999. He was finishing his MBA at Rotman. He was confident and funny, and he had this way of making you feel like you were the most interesting person in the room, which I later understood to be a skill and not a quality, but I didn't know that then. We dated for 2 years. We got engaged on a dock at his family's cottage in Muskoka. We married in June of 2002 at a reception hall in Mississauga, with 140 guests, and a DJ who played Shania Twain twice and nobody complained. I was 29, he was 31. We thought we knew what we were doing. The pediatric intensive care unit is not a place where people make small talk about their weekends. It's not a place where you leave your shoes at the door and decompress with a glass of wine. You carry it home with you every shift, not always the specific cases, but the weight of them, accumulated over years until it becomes part of how you hold yourself, how quickly you move through a grocery store, how you react when someone behind you drops something loud and sudden. What I did there, the real version of it, is hard to explain to people who haven't seen it. I cared for children who had undergone open-heart surgery at 3 days old. I managed ventilators for kids who couldn't breathe on their own and monitored drug infusions measured in micrograms, because at that scale, the difference between therapeutic and catastrophic is thinner than paper. I worked alongside physicians and respiratory therapists and pharmacists and social workers, and I was not at the edge of that work. I was at the center of it, at the bedside, for 12-hour shifts that often ran to 14 because there was no one to hand off to, and a child was unstable and you don't leave. There is a particular kind of knowledge that comes from 19 years at a single bedside. It doesn't announce itself. It accumulates in the way you read a monitor before the alarm goes off. The way you know from the sound of a child's breathing that something is shifting 3 minutes before it shows on any screen. The attending physicians knew it. The other nurses knew it. The parents of the children, when they came to trust you, knew it in the way they watched your face when you entered the room, reading your expression before anything else. But I was a bedside nurse. I changed diapers and took temperatures. At home in the early years, Richard would ask about my day and I'd give him enough. A difficult case, a good outcome, a family I felt for. He didn't push for more and I didn't offer it, partly because the work was confidential. Partly because there are things you don't bring to the dinner table if you want to keep the dinner table intact. It seemed like respect for the work. Later I understood it as the first brick in a wall I didn't know we were building. He was doing well. Junior analyst to associate director in 6 years at a firm downtown. He bought a car I'd never have chosen and season's tickets to the Leafs and a wine subscription from a vineyard in Niagara that I drank exactly twice a year. He started using the word portfolio in conversations about our future, and I thought that was reasonable, that it was what adults did. We had our son Elliot in 2004, our daughter Vivienne in 2007. I went back to work after each of them. 3 months with Elliot, 5 with Vivienne, because she had reflux that nobody could explain, and I was not willing to leave her until I understood it myself, which felt professionally complicated in a way I couldn't articulate to Richard. He didn't understand that. He said other mothers managed. I let it go. I let a great number of things go in those years, the way you do when you're tired and the children need you, and it seems easier to release a thing than to fight for it. I told myself it wasn't important. I told myself we were fine. The shift happened slowly, the way water erodes limestone. You don't see it until you look back. Richard's commentary about my work began as jokes. The kind of jokes that aren't quite jokes. The kind that test something and then retreat behind humor when they meet resistance. He'd introduce me at parties as the woman who kept him grounded, who did the real work at home. It sounded like a compliment, if you weren't listening carefully. If you were listening carefully, you heard what it wasn't saying. By the time Elliot started high school, the jokes had hardened into assumptions. Richard had moved into a director-level role and was earning significantly more than me, and he had begun to speak about our household in a way that positioned his income as the real income and mine as supplementary. A nice little extra. Something to keep me busy. You could always go part-time, he said once over dinner. Cut back to 3 shifts a week. God knows you've earned it. Elliot looked up from his phone. She's a charge nurse, he said quietly. He was 16. Richard looked at him. I know that, Elle. Then you know she can't exactly just cut back. There was a silence at the table. Elliot went back to his phone. Vivienne was watching me. She was 13 and already sharp, in the way that girls who pay attention to their mothers get sharp. Not at people, but at the space between what's said and what's meant. I reached over and touched Elliot's hand. He didn't look up, but he turned his palm and held mine for a second, which was more than I could manage without my voice, doing something I didn't want it to do. By 2018, I had been a charge nurse in the PICU for 6 years. I want to be precise about what that means, because Richard was never particularly clear on it, and it turned out that mattered later. Charge nurse in a unit like ours meant that on any given shift I was responsible for the clinical oversight of every patient in the unit. I coordinated care between nursing staff and physicians. I triaged incoming cases, managed bed allocation, made resource decisions in real time, and served as the first point of escalation when something went wrong before a physician could be reached, which happened more than the institutional language would suggest. I was also a preceptor for new graduate nurses, which I had done informally for years before it became an official part of my role. I had trained 41 nurses by the time I left. I had received a National Recognition Award from the Canadian Nurses Association in 2016. There had been a small ceremony in Ottawa that Richard had not attended because it conflicted with a client dinner he'd described as unmissable. My colleague, a woman I'll call Teresa, who has been my closest friend since we started in the same orientation cohort in 1999, had come instead. She'd flown in on her own time and her own money, and she sat beside me and cried when they called my name, and I have never properly thanked her for that. There was a photograph taken that evening. I'm standing at the podium in a dark blazer, holding a glass plaque, and I'm looking somewhere off to the left of the camera. At Teresa, I think, because I remember she made a face at me right before the shutter clicked to stop me from crying. I look like someone who knows exactly where she is and exactly why she's there. That photograph was in my folder in the mediation room on King Street. But I'm getting ahead of myself again. The marriage ended the way long marriages often end. Not with a single dramatic moment, but with an accumulation of distances that eventually become too wide to cross. There wasn't anyone else on either side that I knew of. There was just the steady, quiet recognition that we had become people who shared a house and a calendar and a mortgage and very little else. It was Richard who asked for the divorce. He said he felt like they were roommates. He said he needed something different. He said it in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning in February, while I was pouring coffee. And I remember thinking that I had known this was coming and that I had not known this was coming. Both things true at once in the way that the end of something always feels inevitable and impossible simultaneously. We told the children separately. Elliot was 19 and at Western. He drove home the weekend after we called him, and when he arrived he looked at me for a long time and then said, "You're going to be okay, Mom." He said it with such certainty that I almost believed him. Vivian was 16. She didn't speak for 3 days, which was its own kind of communication. On the 4th day she came downstairs and said she wanted to live with me, and that was the first time I cried in front of either of them. Richard and I agreed on the children's living arrangements without much conflict. Elliot was at school. Vivian wanted to stay in the house she'd grown up in. We agreed she would live with me. Richard found a condo downtown. What we did not agree on was the financial settlement. Richard's position, communicated first through emails and then through Pearson, was that he had been the primary earner for the majority of our marriage and that the financial division should reflect that. He wasn't entirely wrong about the earning history. His income over the previous decade had been substantially higher than mine. But the assertion, and this is the part where Pearson's language started to get very carefully chosen, was that the disparity in earnings reflected a disparity in professional contribution, that my career had been, and I am quoting here, limited in scope and financial impact. Limited in scope. I read that email on a Saturday morning while Vivian was asleep upstairs and I sat with it for a while. I thought about the boy we'd had in the unit 3 years prior, 7 months old, TAP VR repair, the kind of post-surgical instability that is measured in minutes. I thought about the night I'd stayed at the bedside for 4 hours waiting for a pressure number to stabilize, calling the fellow twice, making a drug adjustment that the fellow had ordered and I had anticipated. That child is 4 now. He goes to junior kindergarten somewhere in Markham. His mother sends a Christmas card every year to the unit, limited in scope. I called Teresa that morning and read her the email. There was a pause on the line. "Are you going to fight this?" she said. "I'm going to think about it, Evelyn." That's what she calls me. It's actually not my name, but it's been her name for me since 1999, and I have long since stopped correcting her. You have the CNA award sitting in a box in your closet. You have 40 letters of commendation. You have the letter from the family in Brampton whose kid you saved during that meningitis case in 2017. You have the article in the Nursing Leadership Journal. I didn't say anything. "He called you limited," she said. "Please don't let him." I hired my lawyer, whose name is Anita, 3 weeks before the mediation. I was referred to her by a colleague at work, and I want to say something about what it is like to walk into a meeting with a lawyer when you are 51 years old and you have spent your entire adult life in a job that requires you to be competent and calm and absolutely unflappable, and to discover that you are, in fact, flappable, and that explaining your own worth to a stranger in a fluorescent-lit office is one of the harder things you have ever had to do. Anita listened to me for 45 minutes without writing anything down. Then she said, "What do you have documented?" I told her about the award, the commendations, the journal article, the letters from families. She asked about my role as charge nurse and I explained the scope of it. She asked about patient outcomes and I explained that clinical outcomes in a PICU are not attributable to a single clinician in any way that a legal document would recognize, but that the unit's quality metrics had consistently improved over the years I'd been charge nurse, and that was in the hospital's public reporting. She wrote something down. She asked if I had the photograph from the CNA ceremony. I said I did. She nodded slowly. "Bring it," she said. "Bring everything, but bring that." I asked her why, specifically the photograph. She looked at me with the particular patience of someone who has heard a version of this question many times. Because your husband thinks you're invisible, she said. The photograph makes you visible. It's harder to call someone limited when they're standing at a national podium. I should tell you about the morning of the mediation. Vivian was 17 by then, and she drove me. She'd just gotten her G2. She drove with both hands on the wheel and her eyes very carefully on the road, the way new drivers do when they are concentrating hard and refusing to show it. She pulled up in front of the building on King Street and put the car in park. "You don't have to go in there and prove anything to him," she said. She was looking straight ahead through the windshield. "I know, but you're going to anyway." I looked at her. She still had her driving gloves on, fingerless ones, olive green. She'd found them at Value Village in the fall and wore them constantly in a way that would have embarrassed her a year ago and no longer did. "Yeah," I said. "I am." She nodded. She didn't look at me. "Good," she said. I got out of the car. I had my folder under my arm. I went inside. The mediation room was on the 4th floor. There was a water cooler that made a periodic gulping sound, and a large window overlooking a section of King Street where a streetcar was currently stuck behind a delivery truck. Anita was already there. She was arranging papers and she looked up when I came in and said, "You look tired." "I'm fine." "I know you're fine," she said. "I said you look tired. There's a difference." Richard arrived 6 minutes later with Pearson. Richard had gotten a haircut recently and was wearing the charcoal suit he reserved for presentations. I noticed these things the way you notice details about someone you've spent 20 years learning. Not with feeling, exactly, but with the strange precision of long familiarity. He nodded at me. I nodded back. We sat down. The first 40 minutes were procedural. Anita laid out our position clearly and without drama. We were seeking an equitable division of matrimonial property. The house, the retirement savings, the investment accounts. Richard's position, as Pearson presented it, relied heavily on the income differential. He had charts. He had compound projections. He had a laminated page that compared our respective contributions to the household's financial growth over 21 years. It was comprehensive. It was also a particular kind of argument, the kind that is technically true and substantially dishonest. I kept my folder closed. Pearson made his presentation. Richard sat with his arms crossed and his expression suggesting this was all a formality. At one point he said, for the second time in our proceedings, words to the effect that my nursing work, while valuable in its way, had not been a significant driver of the family's financial position, and that the mediation should reflect the reality of who had built what, while valuable in its way. Anita looked at me. I opened my folder. I took out the photograph, just the photograph, and placed it face up on the table in front of Pearson. It's a good photograph. I can say that without vanity because I wasn't the one who took it. The podium has the CNA logo on it. I'm clearly in formal dress. The plaque is legible. There is a banner behind me that says Excellence in Clinical Nursing Practice. National Recognition Award. I have been told, like someone who is exactly where she is supposed to be. Pearson looked at it. His expression changed in that small specific way that expressions change when a person has encountered information they were not accounting for. Richard leaned over to look. I slid the rest of the documents across one at a time. The award description. The letter from the CNA. 3 of the 40 commendations I'd selected. The ones with the most specific language about clinical decision-making and patient outcomes. The letter from the family in Brampton. The Nursing Journal article in which I was cited as primary contributor. I didn't say anything while I laid them out. Anita didn't say anything either. There was a sound from the streetcar outside. Someone below honked. The water cooler gulped. Pearson cleared his throat. He turned to Richard and said something quietly. Richard looked at the photograph again. Then he looked at me, not the way he used to look at me, not even the way he'd been looking at me across mediation tables for weeks. He looked at me in a different way. I don't know exactly what it was. Recognition, maybe. The specific recognition of having badly misunderstood something for a very long time. Pearson put his hand on the table. I think we need a few minutes, he said. If that's all right. Anita said of course. They stepped out into the hallway. The door closed behind them. I sat in that room with the streetcar noise and the water cooler, and the photograph of myself facing up on the table. And I thought about the nurse who sat with me at 2 a.m. when I was 11 years old and couldn't sleep. I thought about 41 nurses I'd trained. I thought about a boy in Markham who goes to junior kindergarten and sends a Christmas card every year. I thought about Vivian in her olive green driving gloves, keeping both hands on the wheel. I thought about 19 years of walking into a unit where the smallest, most fragile patients in the hospital fought for things the rest of us forget to be grateful for. I had not spent those years being limited. I won't tell you every detail of what was negotiated in the weeks that followed. That's not the point of this. What I will tell you is that the final settlement was substantially different from what Richard's initial position had described. The house stayed with me, which meant Vivienne got to finish her last year of high school without packing boxes. The retirement savings were divided equitably. The investment accounts were addressed in a way that my lawyer described as fair, and I described to Teresa as not bad at all, which made her laugh in that particular Teresa way where she laughs and then immediately becomes serious again and says, "No, but actually, Richard and I don't speak often now. When we do, it's about the children, which is as it should be." Elliot graduated from Western the following spring and came home for the summer and fixed the back deck, which had needed it for 2 years. Vivienne is in her first year at Dal studying environmental science, and she calls me every Sunday at 7:30, which is the best part of my week. Teresa and I got dinner at a small Italian place on College Street a few weeks after the final paperwork was signed. We ordered a bottle of Barolo that was more than I would usually spend on wine, and I didn't care. She raised her glass and she didn't make a speech about it, because Teresa is not a speech person. She just held up her glass and looked at me, and I understood what she meant. I still work at Sick Kids. I took a short leave after everything was finalized, 2 weeks, which I spent mostly reading and taking long walks along the Humber and sleeping in a way I hadn't slept in years. Then I went back. The first morning I was back, I walked into the unit at 0650, and one of my nurses, a young woman named Victoria who I had precepted 2 years prior, and who has become excellent in a way I find genuinely moving, looked up from the nursing station and said, "Welcome back, Charge." I hung up my coat. I checked the board. I looked at the patient list. I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I told this story not because I want you to think I handled it perfectly, or that I was heroic, or that the right thing always wins. I don't know what always wins. I know what happened to me, in one room on one morning, when I placed a photograph on a table and said nothing. My daughter asked me once, after everything was settled, whether I wished I had spoken up sooner. Whether I should have corrected the record years earlier, pushed back at the dinner table, said something at all those parties where I was introduced as the woman who kept things grounded. I thought about it for a long time before I answered her. "No," I said. The work was the answer. I just had to wait until someone asked the right question. She sat with that for a moment. Outside, the neighbor's dog was barking at something it found in the yard, and the afternoon light was doing that particular autumn thing where it comes sideways through the kitchen window and makes everything look like it's held in something gentle. "Okay," she said finally. "I think I get that. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply make it impossible for someone to keep pretending they never saw you."